I do not want to go back there.
You are coming with me.
I do not want to go back there. You are not going back.
She was dragged behind a horse for refusing marriage, until a rancher shot the rope. Wild West Love. The dust had not yet settled from the last thunderstorm, when Caleb Thorne spotted the girl being dragged by her hair across the dry creek bed. He was riding west along the edge of the Dragoon Mountains, the sun low and hot on his shoulders, when the glint of sunlight on metal caught his eye. A man had hold of a woman's hair in one fist and a revolver in the other, dragging her backward through the dirt like she was nothing more than a sack of feed. Her arms flailed, legs kicking up plumes of dust, but her screams were choked by the blood in her mouth. Her dress, made of woven cloth and adorned with beadwork, was torn at the shoulder, one moccasin missing. Caleb did not think. He kicked his roan hard in the ribs and flew down the slope. He had one shot in the chamber and two in his belt. The rope hung coiled at his saddle horn. He had used it to break wild mustangs and pull lost calves from the brush. Today it would serve another purpose. The man dragging her was lean and mean-looking, with a twitchy jaw and a twitchier trigger finger. When he saw Caleb bearing down, he turned, raised the pistol. Caleb fired once. The bullet struck the man square in the chest and dropped him without a sound. The woman collapsed to her knees, as if her strings had been cut. The silence after the shot was sharp as glass. Caleb reined in, breathing hard, hands still tight on the grip of his revolver. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away, and if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway to keep more Wild West love stories coming. He jumped down and ran to her. "Miss," he said, kneeling beside her. "You're hurt." She blinked up at him through a curtain of tangled dark hair, her lip torn and bleeding, one eye already swelling shut. Her voice cracked. "You were going to kill me." Caleb pulled his canteen from the saddle and tipped it toward her lips. Not anymore. She drank, coughed, then drank again. He stood and looked over the man's body. No badge, no mercy. "What's your name?" he asked gently, crouching again. She hesitated, then said, "Kaya." He nodded once. "Caleb Thorne. You are safe now, Kaya." She looked up at him, really looked this time, and something behind her bruised features flickered a spark of belief. Maybe hope. He helped her to her feet. She swayed, so he steadied her with an arm around her waist. "I do not want to go back there," she whispered. "You are not going back," he said. "You are coming with me." With one hand, he uncoiled the rope from his saddle. He tied the dead man's wrists and ankles, dragging the body away from her line of sight. Then he looped the rope over the saddle horn and mounted up, pulling Kaya into the saddle in front of him. She winced as she settled, and he wrapped an arm around her carefully, keeping her steady. The ride stretched into 2 endless hours, though time seemed to have lost all meaning. The desert did not forgive, and neither did the memories that chased them. Caleb's roan carried them steadily across the sage flats, hooves thudding like a drumbeat of sorrow. The girl sat slumped behind him, her arms loose around his waist, her breath shallow against his back. He could feel the tremor in her chest each time the wind cut her skin. She had not spoken since the shot that silenced Silas. Only her silence rode with him now, heavier than the revolver at his hip, heavier than the ghosts already perched on his shoulders. By the time they reached his lean-to, the sun had sunk low and angry, painting the Dragoon ridges in a blaze of crimson that looked more like blood than light. His small shelter crouched at the base of a red rock wall, half hidden by the twisted shapes of sage and juniper. A thin curl of smoke rose from the chimney, a fragile sign of life in a land that devoured the weak. Caleb swung down first, boots sinking into the dry earth. He reached up carefully, his hands steady despite the storm in his chest. "Easy now," he murmured, as though she were a wounded colt. His palm pressed lightly against her back as he guided her down. She stumbled when her feet touched the ground, and instinctively he caught her, his calloused hands gentle against her arm. Inside, the lean-to smelled of pine resin and old smoke. The air was warm from the small fire he had left burning, but the warmth seemed an insult to her shivering frame. She moved like a ghost, each step hesitant, as if she doubted the floor beneath her was real. He pulled out the bench near the hearth. "Sit," he said softly. She obeyed, lowering herself with stiffness, her dark eyes scanning the single room, the rough-hewn walls, the few possessions of a solitary man. Her gaze seemed to question whether she was safe or simply trapped in a new kind of prison. Caleb busied himself with the water. He found a clay bowl, poured it full from the barrel in the corner, and dipped a clean strip of cloth. When he returned, she flinched at the sight of his hand approaching, her body jerking back like a deer bracing for the arrow. But she did not run, and she did not push him away. Her strength had already been bled into the dust. Slowly, carefully, he pressed the damp cloth to her cheek. The dried blood came away in streaks, revealing bruised skin beneath. He worked in silence, wiping her temple, the corner of her mouth, the gash across her brow. Each touch was a question he could not voice. "How much pain have you carried? How long have you been alone?" After a long silence, his voice broke low. "Did he know you?" She swallowed, the sound small and sharp in the still room. "Yes." Her voice was thin, fragile, yet steady like a string pulled too tight. "His name was Silas. He rode with a bounty crew from the mining town. Said I belonged to them now." Her lips trembled, then steadied, though her eyes burned with a fire that came from grief more than anger. "I tried to run, but he caught me." Caleb's jaw clenched. He had seen cruelty before, had lived in its shadow, but hearing it aloud was like a blade twisted in the ribs. He wanted to spit Silas's name into the fire, watch it burn to ash. "He was wrong," he said, his voice roughened with more than dust. Her gaze lifted to him then, searching his face with a fragile kind of defiance, as if daring him to betray her too. "Why did you help me?" she asked, each word pulled like thorns from her throat. He looked at her, really looked, the torn dress with beadwork that spoke of careful hands, the bare foot bruised from stone, the long braid frayed and dust-streaked, and beneath all that, the hollow in her eyes where trust should have lived. "Because someone had to," he answered finally. His voice cracked against the weight of it. "Because no one should be dragged through dirt like that and left to die." Her mouth trembled, a small break in the fortress of her silence. She let out a breath that shuddered more than it sighed. "No one ever helped me before," she whispered. It was not a confession so much as an indictment of the world that had failed her again and again. Caleb felt something twist inside him, something he had thought long dead. He stood abruptly, needing to move, to hide the sting in his throat. He stirred the fire with the poker, watching the sparks leap and die. "Well," he said, keeping his eyes on the flames, "you have me now." The words sounded clumsy, too small against the enormity of her pain. Yet when he risked a glance back, he saw her eyes soften, just a fraction, as though the promise, however broken, however fragile, was the first she had ever been given. That night, Caleb gave her his bedroll. She lay curled beneath the blanket, her body rigid at first, then slowly yielding to exhaustion. He stayed by the fire, rifle within easy reach, his shoulders tense, his ears straining for every sound beyond the log walls. Coyotes wailed somewhere far off, their cries like mournful hymns rising into the night. He did not sleep. His gaze stayed fixed on the shifting shadows, each flicker of flame carving shapes against the wood. He had lived alone long enough to know the difference between silence that comforts and silence that condemns. This silence condemned the land, the men who hunted, perhaps even himself. From the bedroll came soft murmurs, words in her native tongue, syllables heavy with memory. He could not understand them, but the sound was enough to make his chest ache. Her voice trembled even in sleep, carrying the weight of generations who had endured loss upon loss. He wondered if she dreamed of the creek bed, of Silas's grip in her hair, of the blood filling her mouth. And as he sat there, staring into the flames, he realized something he did not want to admit. He was no savior. He was just another man trying to outrun his own darkness. But tonight, for reasons he could not name, he would hold that darkness back for her sake. The hours dragged on, heavy and unkind. The shadows shifted, the fire hissed, and the desert wind pressed against the walls. Caleb remained awake, listening not just for danger but for the fragile sound of her breath, proof that she was still here, still alive, still fighting to exist in a world that had already tried to erase her. And in that fragile, flickering night, he understood. Saving her had saved a part of himself, too. In the morning, she found him making coffee, a pan of biscuits warming near the fire. She stepped close, holding the blanket tight around her shoulders. "I do not know how to say thank you," she said quietly. "You do not have to." He handed her a cup. She took it, their fingers brushing. She did not pull away. 2 days passed. She stayed quiet, helping where she could, sweeping out the lean-to, brushing down his roan, washing clothes by the creek. Her bruises turned yellow and green, then slowly faded. So did the fear in her eyes. Caleb watched her when she thought he wasn't. There was something about the way she moved, like she had learned to live small, to take up as little space as possible. He hated that for her. On the 4th day, she came to him while he was patching a tear in his saddle. "I want to stay," she said. "Here, if you will let me." He paused, lowering the needle. "You sure?" She nodded. "I have no one left. My people were scattered by the soldiers 2 winters ago. My uncle only wanted the land. I will work for my place. I will not be a burden." "You are not a burden," he said. "You never were." Her eyes filled and she looked down quickly. Caleb stepped forward. "You are safe here, Kaya. You always will be." She looked up. "You mean that with everything you have?" They stood there a long moment, the sun warm on their faces, the breeze rustling through the sage. Then slowly she reached out and took his hand, and he held on like he never meant to let go again. The wind had shifted with the season that week, carrying the resin-sweet scent of pine and the dry ache of earth through the sparse line of trees. The days stretched long and golden, warm enough to deceive, but each morning still bit with the edge of near autumn, as though the land itself could not decide whether to let go of summer or surrender to the slow dying of the year. Kaya stood at the edge of a rocky patch where the ground seemed to resist her, a stubborn tangle of weeds and stone. Caleb had let it go wild in neglect, perhaps because a man alone rarely sees beyond the needs of his next meal or the next bullet in his belt. Her sleeves were rolled high past her elbows, her hands sunk deep into the soil, dark crescents of dirt lining her fingernails. She worked in silence, shoulders bowed, her breath steady, her eyes fixed on the roots she pulled loose one by one, as though she might free herself by freeing the earth. From the doorway of the shed, Caleb watched. A hammer sat heavy in his palm as he drove new nails into a fence post, each strike ringing sharp in the still afternoon. Yet his eyes strayed more to her than to the wood. He did not call out, did not intrude. Some sorrows demanded space, some griefs required silence. He only let her move at her own quiet rhythm, the rhythm of someone trying to stitch herself back into the world with each handful of weeds she tore free. The sun dipped low by late afternoon, bleeding its last warmth across the clearing. Kaya straightened, dirt streaking her arms, her palms raw where the roots had fought back. She dragged her sleeve across her brow, then walked toward him, squinting against the dying light. Her voice, when it came, was low but sure. "You got nails for that in the crate behind you." "Second row." He glanced back, nodded. Without waiting, she fetched them herself, crouching near the growing stack of cut boards. Her fingers brushed the crate, and for the briefest second, he saw them tremble not from weakness, but from the unrelenting memory of every hand that had once hurt her. Yet she steadied them, pulling the nails free, and setting them by his boot. "That ground," she said, tilting her chin toward the patch she had wrestled with all morning, "it's got good soil under all the mess. You could grow potatoes there come spring." Her words carried more than planting. They carried the fragile hope of someone who still dared to believe life might come from ruin. Caleb's grip tightened on the hammer, his gaze fixed on the half-mended post. "I never had much luck with planting," he admitted. The words fell flat, heavy with the truth of a man who had known only the short harvest of violence. "Don't have the patience for it." Kaya's eyes lingered on him, soft with something close to defiance. "Maybe you didn't have the right hands helping." Lev. For a heartbeat, silence held them thick, almost painful. He did not answer, not because he dismissed her, not because he doubted her, but because the thing that swelled in his chest, The thing her words touched had no language he could bear to speak aloud. Gratitude, yes, but more than that, a sorrowful kind of awe that she, broken and bloodied, could still look at hard ground and see the possibility of life. He set the hammer down, his hand resting against the rough timber as though steadying himself. She stayed crouched beside the boards, the dirt still clinging to her hands, her braid loose, her face shadowed by the dying sun. Neither spoke again, yet in the unspoken hung something more binding than words, an unvoiced vow that perhaps, in each other's silence, there might be space enough to heal. And as the wind swept through the trees once more, carrying with it the mingled scents of pine, smoke, and soil, Caleb realized that sorrow had not left them, and perhaps never would. But within sorrow, there was the faintest, most fragile trace of belonging. She didn't push the silence. After a while, she spoke again, softer. "I used to think if I moved quiet enough, kept my head down, bad men would forget I was there." He set the hammer aside and leaned on the workbench, eyes on her. "Did that ever work?" "No, but I got good at pretending it did." He crossed his arms. "You don't have to pretend anything here." "I know." She looked up. "That's what scares me." He didn't move, didn't speak, just let her words settle between them like dust on the floorboards. Then she stood, brushing off her skirt. "Come with me," she said, not asking. They walked to the tree line where the creek curved behind the cabin. A cluster of flat stones jutted over the water. She stepped onto one and sat, motioning for him to join her. "My father taught me to skip stones," she said after a beat. "He said the trick was in the wrist, not the arm. I never got more than 3 skips." He picked up a smooth rock and flicked it across the water. It skipped 5 times before vanishing. "Show off," she murmured, but her mouth bent into something close to a smile. He handed her the next one. She threw it, clumsy and short, but it hopped once before sinking. "See, I'm improving." He looked at her hands, still chapped from creek water and dirt, then at her face, where the bruising had faded to a faint shadow. "You were a chief's daughter, weren't you?" he said. "You must have been handy with horses. Only geldings." "Stallions spooked me." She paused, until I realized it wasn't the horses I feared, just the men who broke them. His jaw tensed, but she didn't seem to notice. She leaned back on her palms, face tilted toward the sky. "You ever been married?" she asked. "Number." "Why not?" "Never found the right reason." She looked over at him, eyes steady. What would the right reason be? He didn't answer right away. The sound of the creek filled the quiet, soft and constant. "Someone who knows how to stay," he said finally, "even after the worst of it." She nodded once, then looked back to the water. "Then, I hope you find her." He turned his face toward her. "Maybe I already have." She didn't look at him, but her fingers curled around the edge of the stone beneath her. They sat that way until the sun dipped low, brushing the tops of the trees with gold. When they walked back, she didn't keep distance between them. Her shoulder brushed his once, and she didn't move away. If you like Wild West love stories or Wild West stories, drop a bunch of 1 second and your place in the comments for the Wild West Love channel. Tell me where you're listening from so I don't feel so alone out here. Inside, the small room glowed faintly, shadows pressing close against the rough log walls. Kaya bent over the cast-iron pot suspended above the fire, stirring beans and salt pork with a steady hand, though her wrist ached and her shoulders carried the weight of exhaustion. The smell of smoke and salt filled the lean-to, clinging to her hair, her clothes, her skin. Caleb struck a match and lit the lantern, its amber glow falling across the curve of her jaw, the line of her throat, where the day's dust still lingered. The light turned her into something fragile yet unyielding, a silhouette carved from suffering and stubborn will. When she ladled the beans into 2 battered bowls, she slid one across the table toward him without ceremony. For a time, the only sound was the scrape of spoons and the crackle of fire. Then, her voice, quiet but unflinching, broke through. "You ever think about leaving these lands?" she asked, her spoon poised halfway to her lips. Caleb's eyes lifted to hers, dark and steady, as though measuring the question more than the answer. "No," he said simply. His voice was rough, carrying the weight of dust storms and lonely years. This land's honest, even when it's mean. She tilted her head, considering that. The fire caught in her eyes like sparks caught in glass. Same could be said about you. He didn't argue. He never did when the truth cut too close. Instead, silence settled back between them, heavy but not empty. It was the silence of two people who had nothing left to waste on lies. After they had eaten, she gathered the bowls, her hands lingering in the warm water as she washed them. He moved to the far corner, where the shadows thickened near the window. Reaching high, he pulled down a small wooden box from the shelf. The wood was worn smooth by years of handling, the edges carved with careful marks of a woman's hand long gone. He set it gently on the table before her. "This belonged to my mother," he said, his voice low as if speaking too loud might disturb the memory. "She carved it herself after my father died." Kaya's breath stilled. With careful fingers, she lifted the lid. Inside, velvet-lined and dulled with age, lay a silver brooch shaped like a wolf howling at the moon. The metal glimmered in the lantern light, fragile yet defiant, like a cry that refuses to die even when no one is listening. "I'd like you to have it," Caleb said. Her eyes darted from the brooch to his face, searching for the meaning beneath his words. "Why me?" Her voice wavered, almost breaking, as if afraid to accept something she had never been offered, something freely given. He looked at her, his expression carved with the honesty of a man who had nothing left to hide. "Because you ain't the sort to hide your spirit anymore." Her hands trembled as she lifted the brooch, the silver cool against her skin. Her breath caught, ragged in her throat, as though the small weight carried more than metal, it carried recognition, a reminder that she was still seen, still worth something in a world that had tried to strip her bare. She didn't speak. Couldn't. But when her eyes rose to his, something in them shifted. Not peace, not yet. The ache was still there, carved deep. But it was the beginning of it, the fragile spark of trust, faint but alive. Later that night, when she retreated to the small bed tucked behind the partition, she did not close the door between herself and the hearth where Caleb sat. The fire's glow reached across the empty space, binding them with its flickering thread. He did not cross to her, did not touch her, though his chest ached with the weight of wanting to protect what was already his heart. In the dark, when the silence grew too heavy, she turned toward the faint light and spoke. Her voice was soft, almost shy, but clear. "Good night, Caleb." He closed his eyes, let the words settle in his chest like a vow. "Good night, Kaya." The promise was simple, almost nothing at all. Yet, in a world of broken vows and bloodied ground, it was everything. The first frost came early that year. It crusted the morning grass silver and made the pump handle bite cold in the hand. Kaya wrapped her shawl tighter and leaned her weight into priming the pump until the water sputtered out clear and cold. She filled the kettle and brought it inside where Caleb was fixing the latch on the barn door hinge. "You've got a visitor," she said without looking up, setting the kettle on the stove. He straightened. A rider came up from the south trail. Didn't get close, just turned his horse and waited by the edge of the trees. Caleb stepped onto the porch, hand resting light on the butt of his revolver as he scanned the tree line. A figure on horseback sat still in the saddle, watching the dry grass. "Stay inside," he said. "I'm not hiding. I'm not asking you to." She met his eyes for a moment, then nodded and stepped back inside, her hand lingering near the rifle propped by the door. Caleb walked out slow, boots crunching frost, stopping 10 yards from the stranger. "You looking for someone?" The man tipped his hat back, older, grizzled, one ear scarred down to the lobe. "Name's Whit Lelton. I was trail boss down at the Harper spread before Silas got himself mixed up in bad business." Caleb didn't blink. "He's dead," I figured. Words already moving. "I ain't here to raise hell about it." Whit shifted in the saddle. "Just thought it right to say the man had kin sister's boy. She'll want to know what happened. He tried to kill a woman." "I ain't saying he didn't." Whit looked off toward the ridge, but blood's still blood. "I'll tell her he got what he earned, but I had to lay eyes on the man who finished it." Caleb gave a tight nod. "You've seen him." Whit studied him a long moment. "You keeping her here?" "She's here because she chooses it. Then let her be." Wit turned his horse. This land's mean enough without old ghosts stirring it up. When he rode off, Caleb stood a while longer, watching the trees sway in the windless morning. Inside, Kaya had set 2 mugs of coffee on the table. She didn't ask what was said. He didn't offer it. Later that day, she brought down a wooden box from the loft rafters. I found this behind the chimney stones. He pried the lid loose. Inside lay a rusted flintlock pistol, 2 yellowed letters, and a child's carved wooden horse, paint worn to bare grain. That was my brother's, Caleb said, voice low. He died in the blizzard of 2068, buried him up by the North Bluff. She touched the toy with a fingertip. You never told me you had a brother. There wasn't much to say. He was kind, laughed a lot. Took a fever trying to help Pa dig out the cattle. Kaya closed the box. You kept it all these years. Some things don't belong to time. She didn't speak for a while, then said, The man Silas worked for my uncle. He'll come looking when he realizes I'm not just gone, but stayed gone. Then we'll be ready. Her hand covered his on the table. There's no we in the world I came from. There is now, he said. She didn't pull away. Hey, friend, go grab a full glass of water. People often forget to drink enough, and that's actually a pretty serious issue for you. That night, as the wind howled through the gaps in the boards, she stood by the unlit hearth, her silhouette thrown long across the floor. I used to dream of a place that didn't ask me to shrink to fit it, she said, but I never thought I'd find it where the land ends in dust and pine. Caleb came to stand beside her. Place doesn't matter. It's the people in it. Her voice was a whisper. Then I choose you. He reached for her hand, slow. And I choose you. She leaned into him, and he held her. The fire between them not yet built, but already warm. The snow came in thin, drifting sheets that whispered across the valley floor and caught in the fence line. It didn't stay long, just enough to hush the land and keep the cattle close to the trees. Kaya stood in the barn doorway, arms folded beneath her coat, watching Caleb saddle the mule. He cinched the strap and checked the pack twice before tightening the bedroll beneath it. You sure you want to go alone? She asked. He nodded without looking up. It's only a day's ride to town. I'll be back before dark tomorrow. She stepped forward, voice low. If your name's attached to Silas's death, someone might try to make a show of it. They'll have to come through me first. I'd prefer they didn't come at all, she said, brushing hay from the sleeve of his coat. But if they do, don't be clever. Just come back. He caught her hand as she turned. There's a tin box under the floorboard by the hearth. If anything happens before I return, take it and ride north. Follow the creek until the old railroad post. There's a Swedish family there. They'll help. I'm not leaving you behind. You won't be. Just a precaution. She didn't argue, but her jaw set in a way that told him she wouldn't be running unless forced. He kissed her forehead, brief and firm, then mounted and rode out into the pale morning. In town, the wind twisted the smoke flat against the rooftops. Caleb tied the mule outside the mercantile and stepped in, nodding to the clerk behind the counter. Need salt, lamp oil, and linen thread, he said. Also some coffee if you've got it. The clerk, a wiry man with gray in his beard, nodded and began pulling items from the shelves. Heard there's trouble brewing out your way. Ranch hands from down south asking after a missing girl. Caleb's eyes narrowed. They were here a couple days back. Said she ran off with something that wasn't hers. She didn't. The clerk gave a tight shrug. Didn't figure she did. But men like that don't care much for truth. You want me to keep word from getting out you were in? Appreciate it. He paid in coin and took the sack out to the mule. As he turned to mount up, a voice rang out across the street. You, the one who put Silas in the ground. Caleb turned slow. 3 men stood outside the saloon. One wore a sheriff's star, but his hand rested on his belt in a way that said he wasn't there for peacekeeping. I did what had to be done, Caleb said. The man with the badge stepped forward. The Harper family says that ain't your call. They weren't there. A silence settled over the street like a dropped blanket. Then the sheriff's lip curled. You think hiding up in those hills keeps you clean? I'm not hiding. You will be soon enough. He turned to spit, then walked away without another word. Caleb left town through the back trail, sticking close to the riverbank, and riding hard once the sun began to drop. Snow started falling again by the time he reached the cabin. If you're watching on television, don't hesitate, grab your phone, and hit subscribe to my channel so you'll never miss out on our amazing characters. Bye-bye. Đoạn 5 bản tiếng Anh. Kaya was already outside, lantern in hand, rifle slung over her shoulder. "You're late," she said. "I came back," he said, voice rough from wind and cold. She stepped forward and pressed her forehead to his chest. Then, nothing else matters. He unsaddled the mule and brought the supplies inside. She set water to boil while he warmed his hands by the stove. "They know," he said, "and they're not going to let it lie. How long do we have?" "Not long." She turned from the stove. "Then we do what we must." He looked over at her, the flicker of firelight catching in her hair. "That doesn't scare you." "It does," she said, voice steady, "but I've been scared before. This time I have something worth standing for." They slept light that night, rifles loaded by the door, boots beside the bed. The wind howled against the shutters, but no riders came. In the morning, she stood on the porch with her coat buttoned high and her hands in her pockets. "I've been thinking," she said, watching the sun rise over the ridge. "My mother used to say, a woman's strength isn't in what she bears, but in what she builds after." He stepped beside her, the cold biting through his shirt. "What do you want to build?" Her gaze didn't waver. "A life. One where no one has to run." Caleb reached for her hand. "Then we'll start today." She didn't smile, just nodded once, firm and sure, and together they stepped down into the snow-covered yard, the day ahead of them, quiet and waiting. The first of them came at sunrise. 3 riders, all strangers, with dust on their coats and rifles slung low. They didn't speak when they reached the gate, just dismounted and fanned out, boots crunching frostbitten grass. Caleb stood on the cabin stoop, rifle in hand, while Kaya watched from the barn's shadow, her breath coming slow and measured. "Which of you the man called Thorn?" the tallest asked, voice flat as a winter pond. "You're on my land," Caleb said calmly. "State your business." The man adjusted his gloves. "We were told a woman ran off with something that don't belong to her." "That true? She took nothing but her life back." The man stepped forward. "That's not how her uncle tells it. She's not his to speak for." Caleb's grip didn't tighten, but his stance shifted, weight balanced just enough to hold ground. One of the others raised an eyebrow. "You aiming to die for her?" Before Caleb could answer, Kaya stepped into view, rifle already trained. "He doesn't have to. I won't be stolen again." The men turned, startled to see her standing tall, shoulders squared, coat open to reveal the worn leather thong tied at her throat. "I left with nothing but bruises and my name," she said. "If your boss wants more than that, he'll have to take it from my hands." The tall man looked between them, then nodded once. "We were paid to ask, not to bleed." He swung onto his saddle without another word. The others followed. They didn't look back. The wind picked up again after they cleared the ridge. Caleb watched them until the trees swallowed the sound of hooves. "You didn't have to come out," he said. "I did," she answered. "If I'm going to build something worth keeping, it can't be built from behind someone else's back." He took her rifle gently, set it against the porch rail, and reached for her hand. "Let's finish this winter together." She didn't hesitate when she stepped into his arms. The days that followed passed steady and honest. They sealed the barn door against the coming deep freeze and shoveled coal from the old pit behind the shed. At night they read by lamplight from the few books Caleb's mother had left behind, pages creased from decades of hands, words worn soft with time. One evening, as the snow drifted high against the windows, Kaya placed a folded square of linen on the table. "I kept this with me through every place I ran," she said, unfolding it to reveal a single embroidered name stitched in red thread, her mother's. "Now it belongs somewhere still." Caleb traced the stitches with his thumb. "You want to bury it?" "No," she said. "I want to hang it above the hearth. So she's part of this." He hammered a nail into the beam and set it there, the cloth catching the firelight like a flag. "If you've made it this far, I know you're a true fan of WWL. From the bottom of my heart, I wish your day is filled with health and happiness, and may a little stroke of luck find you in the next 15 minutes. Don't forget to share it with me in the comments. They shared the bed after that, quietly, without ceremony. She folded into him as if she'd always known the shape of his shoulder, and he breathed against her hair as if it had always smelled like sage and dry earth. Spring came slow with thawed earth and the first green shoots in the garden. Kaya knelt beside the rose, her fingers coaxing sprouts free. Caleb built a chicken pen with salvaged wire and taught her how to set traps for foxes. One morning she handed him a small envelope bound in twine. "From the town clerk," she said. He sent it up with the salt. Inside was a deed. Her uncle had sold what was left of the ranch and left the territory. No claim filed, no charges pressed, just a note in the margin. No kin left. She exhaled once, sharp and final. Then she turned to Caleb. "That part's done." He nodded and took her hand. "So, what comes next?" "I think we plant corn," she said, "and maybe get another horse. I don't like the way your mule looks at me." He laughed, the sound warm and easy. "She's jealous. I used to talk to her before you came." "Well," Kaya said, brushing dirt from her skirt, "you talk to me now." In June, they rode to the justice of the peace in a small dusty town. The ceremony was short and plain, but when Caleb slipped the small silver ring onto her finger, Kaya's eyes shone like wet stone in sunlight. They came home to the cabin with a sack of flour, 2 hammers, and a tin of peppermint drops she'd picked out for the road. That night, he carved their names, Kaya and Caleb, into the beam above the door. Years passed, quiet and full. The fence held through 4 winters. The garden grew thick with squash and beans. They built a second room off the back, filled it with books and a rocking chair. They never needed more. One late summer evening, Kaya stood on the porch, her hands resting on her belly, round beneath her dress. The wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain. Caleb came up behind her, arms circling her waist. "You think it's a boy or a girl?" he asked. She leaned back into him. "I think it's ours." He kissed her temple, his touch light as breath. "That's more than I ever hoped for." The sun dipped behind the ridge, then spilling gold across the valley. And in the hush that followed, with the land soft beneath their feet, and the world held close around them, Kaya closed her eyes and smiled. She had stayed, and for the first time in her life, the staying felt like freedom. The whispers of the past, the ghost of the man he once was, and the fears of the woman she was forced to be, all melted away like the snows of winter. The road ahead wasn't clear, but for the first time, they didn't need to know the destination. This wasn't just a cowboy love story. It was a Wild West love story that was only just beginning. The wind, which once carried the cries of the lost, now carried the promise of a future built by hand and heart. They had their own piece of the frontier now, their own Wild West love. Their adventure wasn't a retreat, but a bold journey into an unknown, beautiful future.